9 days, 3 lives lost, 1 death sentence, and nearly 40 years of unresolved debate. In the early morning hours of May 25, 1986, a brutal crime shattered the quiet of a small dry cleaning shop on Section 2 of Xinsheng North Road in Taipei. A husband, a wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, all were killed inside the family business they had poured their savings into. By the end of that same day, a suspect was in custody. His name was Tang Ying-Shen. He was 18 years old. He had arrived in Taipei only 9 days earlier. He had no prior criminal record, and he was a member of the Tzu, one of Taiwan's indigenous peoples. What followed seemed, at first glance, straightforward. Tang confessed. He was tried. He was sentenced to death. Less than 2 years later, he was executed. The case appeared closed. But it never truly was. Because almost immediately, voices across Taiwan began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why had this young man unraveled so quickly? What happened during those 9 days in the city? And why did so many legal scholars, writers, artists, and human rights advocates insist that this case could not be understood as a simple act of violence? Decades later, Tang Ying-Shen's name still ignites controversy. In July 2023, a Taiwanese television drama inspired by this case premiered on Netflix. Marketed as a legal crime series, it explored corruption, labor exploitation, and the lived reality of indigenous people navigating a system stacked against them. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Old wounds reopened. Old arguments resurfaced. And once again, society was forced to confront a case many believed had already been settled. This story is not only about a crime scene. It is about the conditions that led to it. Tang Ying-Shen did not grow up in Taipei. His life began far from the capital, in the mountains of Chiayi County, where indigenous communities lived largely out of sight of urban Taiwan. He was raised in a respected family, excelled in school, and earned admission to a teacher's college with the hope of returning home to educate the next generation. By every outward measure, he was a young man with a future. And yet, in less than 2 weeks, that future collapsed. According to court records and investigative reporting, Tang's journey to Taipei was driven by a job advertisement that promised high pay and easy work. What he encountered instead was a web of labor brokerage fees, mounting debt, confiscated identification documents, and punishing work hours that stretched deep into the night. Isolated, exhausted, and under constant pressure, he began to unravel. Then came the early morning hours of May 25th. What happened inside that dry cleaning shop would leave 3 people dead, 2 children orphaned, and an entire society divided over responsibility, justice, and blame. The courts would focus on the act itself. Others would look beyond it, toward the invisible forces that shaped it. This is the story of Tang Ying-Shen. It is a story about crime, but also about systems. About guilt, but also about context. And about why some cases refuse to remain buried, no matter how much time has passed. Tang Ying-Shen was not shaped by the city. His life began far from Taipei, in the mountains of Chiayi County, where the terrain is steep, the air is thin, and communities rely on one another to survive. His hometown was a small settlement in Wufeng Township, the only mountainous administrative district in Chiayi, covering more than 400 square kilometers, nearly 1/5 of the county's total area. For generations, this region had been home to the Tzu people, one of Taiwan's indigenous groups. Life in these mountains followed a different rhythm. Isolation was not only geographic, but social. Opportunities were limited, and the path beyond the village required education, resilience, and often leaving home. Tang Ying-Shen was born on May 26, 1967, into a family that was widely respected in the community. His father, Tang Baofu, was a local civil servant. More importantly, he was known as a man who acted. When roads did not exist, he organized donations to build them. When bridges were needed to connect the village to the outside world, he led efforts to secure government funding. Because of these contributions, Tang Baofu was seen not only as an official, but as a pillar of the community. Tang's mother, Wang Jimei, carried her own burden. Several years before the crime, she suffered a severe motorcycle accident, falling into a ravine. The injuries left her partially paralyzed and confined to bed. The family structure shifted. Responsibility weighed heavily on the father, and expectations were placed quietly but firmly on the children. There were 3 of them. The eldest son left home to attend a police academy in Taipei. The youngest was still a child. Tang Ying-Shen was the middle son, and from an early age he appeared to carry the family's hopes. In school, he excelled. Teachers described him as diligent and quick to learn. He completed elementary education at a local school and consistently ranked at the top of his class. When he graduated, he received academic recognition at the county level. Among villagers, he earned a gentle nickname that translated roughly to everyone's younger brother, a sign of affection and trust. For Tang, education was more than personal success. It was a responsibility. After finishing junior high school, he passed the entrance examination for Chiayi Teachers College, an institution that trained educators under government sponsorship. Tuition was covered. In return, graduates were expected to serve as teachers, often in rural or indigenous communities. Tang's goal was clear. He wanted to return home and teach at his former elementary school. It was a path that promised stability, respect, and a future rooted in service. But that path began to fracture. Chiayi Teachers College operated under a strict military-style management system. Discipline was rigid. Infractions that might seem minor elsewhere carried severe consequences. During his 3rd year, Tang's behavior drew attention. He was cited for violations such as climbing walls, riding a bicycle with 2 passengers, embroidering his name onto a uniform, and smoking. Some of these allegations were later disputed. In at least one instance, Tang reportedly accepted punishment for a classmate's misconduct rather than expose him. Regardless of intent, the record stood. Tang received an official warning. Under school regulations, another violation during the probation period would result in expulsion. For a government-sponsored student, expulsion meant more than academic failure. It meant the collapse of future employment, the burden of repaying subsidies, and deep personal shame. Tang spoke with his family. After deliberation, they agreed he would temporarily suspend his studies and return home to reflect and adjust. On paper, this was a pause. In reality, it felt like a fall. Back in his village, Tang struggled. He slept poorly. He ate little. The weight of disappointment pressed in from all sides. He had been the promising one, the child who would make it out and then return to lift others with him. Now he felt exposed, uncertain, and increasingly anxious. On May 9, 1986, Tang left home. He wrote a letter to his parents before he went. In it, he explained that after countless internal struggles, he had decided to search for a world of his own. He acknowledged that his choice might seem reckless, but insisted that the pressure had become unbearable. He asked his parents not to worry, not to look for him, and not to see his departure as the end of his future. He signed the letter, "Your unfilial son." And the decision to leave was not driven by rebellion. It was driven by desperation and hope in equal measure. Like many young people at the time, Tang turned to newspaper advertisements. One listing stood out. A newly opened Western-style restaurant in Taipei claimed to be hiring 30 staff members. No experience required. Monthly pay of 15,000 new Taiwan dollars. Uniforms provided. Generous tips. Easy work. Immediate start. For an 18-year-old with little money and no connections, it seemed like an answer. Tang calculated carefully. With that income, he could afford rent in Taipei. He might even take English classes. Perhaps in time he could return to school. The advertisement promised dignity through labor. It offered a way forward without relying on family or charity. What Tang did not know was that the restaurant did not exist. The advertisement had been running for more than a year. The business was not registered. The name was a front. The contact person, Qiu Shifeng, operated a job placement center that specialized in extracting fees from job seekers, particularly those from rural and indigenous backgrounds unfamiliar with urban labor systems. When Tang called the number and asked about the job, he was told to come immediately, bringing identification and registration fees. Tang hesitated. He had left home with just over 1,000 new Taiwan dollars. He asked if he could pay part now and the rest later. Q agreed. To cover the remaining amount, Tang borrowed money from relatives in Taipei's Sanchong district. By the time he returned to the placement office and paid in full, he had already lost a significant portion of his savings. Then the conditions changed. The restaurant, Q said, had not yet opened. It would not be ready until after the Lunar New Year. But there was another opportunity. A dry cleaning shop. Good pay. Immediate start. The brokerage fee, however, was much higher. When Tang hesitated, Q reassured him. The shop owner would advance the fee. It would be deducted from Tang's wages. Tang agreed. It was a decision made under pressure, with incomplete information and no safety net. On May 16, 1986, Tang Ying-Shen began work at the Tonghung dry cleaning shop on Xinsheng North Road. He had been in Taipei for 9 days. The city had not welcomed him. It had closed around him. And the forces that would define the next chapter of his life were already in motion. When Tang Ying-Shen stepped into the Tonghung dry cleaning shop on May 16, 1986, he did not enter as an employee on equal footing. He entered already in debt. The arrangement was presented as routine. The shop owner, Peng Shiheng, had paid the remaining brokerage fee on Tang's behalf. In return, Tang signed a handwritten IOU. The amount listed was higher than expected. Transportation costs had been added. The total debt stood at 2,200 new Taiwan dollars. To secure repayment, Peng kept Tang's identification card. According to later testimony, this practice was not uncommon at the time. Employers who advanced placement fees often held documents as leverage. In legal terms, it existed in a gray zone. In human terms, it stripped a young worker of mobility and choice. That same night, Tang began living inside the shop. There was no separate dormitory, no private room. A section of the owner's young daughter's bedroom was divided by a cloth and a wooden board, creating a narrow corner where Tang slept. It was not a space meant for rest. It was a temporary shelter designed for convenience, not dignity. The workday began at 9 in the morning. It rarely ended before 2 or 3 the following morning. As the Lunar New Year approached, business surged. Customers demanded urgent service. Same-day delivery became routine. Peng Saiheng handled transportation and machinery. His wife, Wang Yu-Chin, managed the front counter while caring for their 2-year-old daughter. Tang was expected to assist wherever needed, often without clear boundaries or breaks. 16 to 17 hours of labor per day became normal. Physically, Tang deteriorated quickly. His body was not accustomed to such strain. He ate irregularly. He slept lightly, if at all. Mentally, isolation set in. He did not have enough money to make long-distance phone calls home. He did not know how long this situation would last, or whether he would ever recover his identification card. Each day, the debt loomed larger than the wages he believed he was earning. By the 8th day, Tang reached his limit. He approached Peng Shiheng and said he wanted to quit. He asked for his identification card back. He explained that the Spring Festival was approaching and that he wanted to return home. By his own calculation, 8 days of work at $500 per day amounted to $4,000. That should have been enough to cover the brokerage fee and leave him with enough to repay relatives and buy a ticket home. Peng rejected that calculation. According to Tang's statement, Peng told him that food and lodging would be deducted. His daily wage, Peng said, was not $500 but $200. After expenses, Tang still owed money. Quitting was not an option. To Tang, the logic was incomprehensible. 8 days of relentless work had not earned him freedom, but deeper obligation. What he believed to be a path forward had become a closed loop. That afternoon, at approximately 4 o'clock on May 24th, Tang left the shop on an errand to deliver laundry. He took advantage of the moment to visit a relative, an older cousin who worked as a pianist and lived on Jiangguo North Road. There, Tang drank heavily. 5 or 6 glasses, according to later accounts. He spoke openly for the first time. He said he wanted to quit. He said he wanted to go home. The cousin listened and reassured him. After the new year, he said, he would help Tang find another job. For a brief moment, there was relief. That evening, Tang returned to the shop and resumed work. Near midnight, exhaustion overcame him. He lay down and cried quietly, homesick and overwhelmed. Sleep came in fragments. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened. A customer had brought in clothing that required urgent cleaning. Peng ordered Tang back to work. The request was not extraordinary by the shop's standards, but to Tang, it was the breaking point. He said he could not continue. He said he wanted to stop. He asked Peng to find someone else. What followed escalated quickly. According to court findings, Peng responded with anger. In the heat of the argument, he used a derogatory slur directed at indigenous people. It was a word heavy with contempt, one that reduced identity to inferiority. For Tang, it was not merely an insult. It was a reminder of how he was seen and how little power he had. The argument turned physical. Peng and Tang struggled. Wang Yuqin rushed in, attempting to intervene. In the chaos, Tang grabbed a hammer that had been left nearby, a common tool used in the shop to remove nails from wooden fixtures. What happened next would define the rest of his life. The violence that followed claimed the lives of Peng Shiheng, Wang Yuqin, and their 2-year-old daughter. The shop fell silent in the early hours of May 25th. 2 other children, the couple's sons, were asleep in a separate room. They survived. In the immediate aftermath, Tang left the scene. As the hours passed, shock gave way to clarity. He later stated that he intended to surrender. He called the Zhongshan police station and arranged to turn himself in. He went to the agreed location and waited. No officers arrived. Confused and exhausted, Tang went to his cousin's home once again. By that time, news of the murders had begun to spread. The police sealed off the crime scene. Afternoon newspapers published headlines describing a family annihilated inside their business. In Chiayi, Tang's family sensed something was wrong. His mother had not heard from him. His father was visited by the local police chief, who asked whether Tang had returned home. When told he had not, the officer warned that Tang might be connected to a murder in Taipei. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Tang called home for the first time in 16 days. He told his mother that he was safe. She urged him to go to the police and explain everything honestly. She believed, as his parents always had, that the truth would protect him. At 6 o'clock, Tang Ying-Shen entered the Zhongshan police station with his older brother. On the taxi ride there, he stared out the window in silence. As they approached the station, he began to cry. He told his brother he wanted to go home, to see whether their parents were well. Then he stepped inside. The trap had closed. When Tang Ying-Shen entered the Zhongshan police station on the evening of May 25, 1986, the facts of the case were already moving faster than he was. Officers had secured the crime scene at the Tuonghung dry cleaning shop. Reporters were gathering. Headlines were being drafted. The story had already taken on a name, a family annihilation in the heart of Taipei. Tang was questioned immediately. He had no prior criminal record. He denied any gang affiliation. He did not attempt to shift blame. According to police records, he described his employment at the dry cleaning shop, his debt, and the confrontation that escalated in the early hours of that morning. He admitted to the killings. From a procedural standpoint, the case appeared uncomplicated. Within days, Tang Ying-Shen was formally charged with murder. Prosecutors characterized the crime as deliberate and brutal. The presence of a young child among the victims removed any ambiguity in their approach. This was, in their view, a case that demanded the harshest penalty available under Taiwanese law. Tang's defense team faced an uphill battle from the beginning. At trial, the central facts were not disputed. Instead, the defense focused on two key arguments. First, that Tang had attempted to surrender voluntarily. Second, that his mental state at the time of the crime had been compromised by exhaustion, alcohol consumption, and extreme stress, warranting further psychiatric evaluation. The court rejected both claims. Regarding voluntary surrender, judges ruled that because the police had already received reports of the crime before Tang arrived at the station, his actions did not meet the legal threshold for self-surrender as defined by statute. The distinction was technical but decisive. In the eyes of the law, intent mattered less than timing. As for Tang's mental condition, the court pointed to his behavior after the killings. He had left the scene, retrieved documents related to his debt, and taken money. These actions, the judges argued, demonstrated awareness and control. There was no basis, they concluded, to consider diminished responsibility. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was silent. Tang Ying-Shen was sentenced to death and permanently deprived of civil rights. News of the verdict spread quickly. But instead of closure, it ignited a national debate. Writers, professors, psychologists, and clergy began to speak out. They did not deny Tang's guilt. They questioned the system that had surrounded him. Law professor Huang Luoqing of National Chengchi University described the case as a social tragedy rather than an isolated crime. Psychologist Yang Guoshu argued that Tang's behavior could not be understood without acknowledging the psychological toll placed on indigenous people navigating urban environments marked by prejudice and exploitation. Others went further. Legal scholars called for an anthropological approach to the case, arguing that the court had failed to consider cultural context. Indigenous poets and artists shared personal stories of labor exploitation and humiliation in the cities. One blind indigenous poet recounted being deceived by job placement centers years earlier and admitted that he too had once felt the urge to retaliate against a society he believed had cheated him. The debate soon expanded beyond the courtroom. At the center of it was an old and deeply contested narrative, the story of Wu Feng. For generations, Taiwanese schoolchildren had been taught that Wu Feng, a Han Chinese official, sacrificed himself to stop headhunting practices among the Tzu people near Alishan. The story portrayed indigenous communities as violent and uncivilized, redeemed only by Han moral intervention. Over time, historians and indigenous scholars challenged the account, pointing out inconsistencies and questioning its origins. In the eyes of many critics, Tang Ying-Shen had inherited this legacy of stigma. He was not judged as an individual alone, they argued, but as a representative of a people long framed as dangerous and inferior. As public pressure mounted, more than 120 prominent figures signed a petition urging President Chiang Ching-kuo to grant clemency. A full-page newspaper advertisement appeared with a simple plea: "Please spare his life." Musicians released albums inspired by the case. Religious leaders prayed publicly for mercy. Yet the political climate remained rigid. Taiwan was still under martial law. The government viewed mass petitions with suspicion, interpreting them as challenges to authority rather than appeals for justice. On January 15, 1987, Tang Ying-Shen was executed. He was not yet 20 years old. According to prison officials, Tang refused anesthetics before the execution. He stated that he deserved the pain. In his final letters, he expressed remorse and prayed for the souls of the victims. He requested that his organs be donated to anyone in need. His father, Tang Baofu, collected his son's belongings afterward. Among them was a small crucifix, bent and warm from Tang's hand. Baofu later said that it had been the only companion his son had in his final moments. The executions did not end the discussion. 2 months later, martial law in Taiwan was lifted, ending nearly 4 decades of authoritarian rule. Social movements that had been suppressed began to surface openly. Indigenous rights activists demanded land restitution and cultural recognition. Statues of Wu Feng were dismantled. Place names were changed. Language shifted. Mountain people and other discriminatory terms were officially abandoned in favor of indigenous peoples. In 1989, Wufeng Township was renamed Alishan. In 2005, Taiwan passed the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law, formally recognizing autonomy and cultural rights. For many, Tang Ying-Shen became a symbol, not of innocence but of failure. A failure to protect vulnerable workers. A failure to regulate labor brokers. A failure to confront prejudice embedded in law and culture. For others, the verdict remained correct. 3 lives had been taken. 2 children had been left without parents. Justice, they argued, had been served. Both positions continue to coexist. Tang Ying-Shen's case destroyed 2 families. One lost parents and a sister. The other lost a son to the firing squad. No ruling, no reform, and no apology can restore what was taken. And that is why, nearly 40 years later, this case still refuses to rest. In the end, the Tang Ying-Shen case offers no simple resolution. On paper, the law was applied. A crime was committed. A confession was made. A sentence was carried out. From a strictly legal standpoint, the system functioned as designed. 3 innocent lives were taken, including that of a 2-year-old child, and the person responsible was punished with the ultimate penalty. But justice is not measured by procedure alone. For the surviving sons of Peng Shiheng and Wang Yuqin, justice meant growing up without parents, carrying memories that no child should bear. Their lives were permanently altered in a single night. No social reform, no academic debate, and no historical reckoning can undo that loss. Any discussion of this case must begin with respect for those victims and the quiet suffering that followed. At the same time, Tang Ying-Shen's execution did not bring the closure many expected. Instead, it forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. His death became a mirror reflecting the fractures within Taiwan's legal and social systems. Labor exploitation that thrived in legal gray zones. Job placement networks that profited from desperation. Prejudice that reduced entire communities to slurs. And a justice system that, in moments of crisis, left little room for context. Tang was not innocent. He took lives. That fact cannot be erased or softened. But neither can the conditions that shaped his collapse. In the years following his execution, Taiwan changed. Martial law ended. Voices that had long been suppressed found space to speak. Indigenous communities demanded recognition not as relics of the past, but as living peoples with rights, history, and dignity. Laws were rewritten. Names were corrected. Myths were challenged. Slowly, the language of exclusion began to lose its authority. None of this brings Tang Ying-Shen back. None of it resurrects the victims. What it does offer is responsibility. Responsibility to remember that crimes do not occur in isolation. Responsibility to protect the vulnerable before desperation turns to violence. Responsibility to examine whether justice punishes only the individual, or whether it also addresses the systems that fail them. Today, Tang Ying-Shen exists largely as a symbol. To some, he represents an unforgivable act that deserved the harshest response. To others, he represents a warning, a life crushed between poverty, prejudice, and indifference. Both interpretations coexist because the truth of this case sits uncomfortably between them. Perhaps that is why it still lingers. Because it asks questions that have no easy answers. Questions about guilt and accountability. About mercy and limits. About how far the law should go and how far society must go to prevent tragedy before it occurs. The Tang Ying-Shen case did not end in 1987. It continues every time we debate the death penalty. Every time a worker is trapped by debt. Every time a young person leaves home believing opportunity awaits, only to find exploitation instead. Justice was carried out. But whether justice was complete remains a question each generation must answer for itself. And that may be the heaviest legacy of all.